February 26, 1931. Bronx, New York. The winter air is sharp and silent. On a quiet stretch of road near the entrance to Pelham Bay Park, a dark green Cadillac slows to a stop beneath a dim street lamp. Inside the car sits one of the most powerful men in American organized crime, Joe Masuria. For nearly a decade, Masuria had ruled New York's underworld with an iron grip. Known as Joe the Boss, he controlled bootlegging operations, gambling rackets, protection schemes, and labor unions across the city. But by early 1931, his empire was crumbling, and he didn't even realize it. Inside the Cadillac, Masuria shifts in his seat. The driver's side door opens. A man steps out. Calm, quiet, loyal. At least, that's what Masuria believed. That man was Charles Luciano. Luciano walks a few steps away from the car, disappearing into the shadows near the park. Moments later, gunshots shatter the silence. Four men rush toward the Cadillac. The door swings open. Bullets explode inside the car. When it's over, Joe Masuria slumps lifeless across the seat. Dead at 44, the killers vanish into the darkness. Within minutes, one of the most powerful bosses in America is gone. But this wasn't just a mob hit. This murder would ignite the bloodiest power struggle New York had ever seen, and it would reshape the entire structure of the American Mafia. To understand why Masuria had to die, you have to go back to the chaos of the 1920s. Prohibition had turned organized crime into a billion-dollar industry. Bootlegging networks stretched across the country. Illegal liquor flowed through secret warehouses, nightclubs, and speakeasies. And New York City was the epicenter. Two powerful Sicilian factions controlled the underworld. One was led by Joe Masuria, the other by a rival boss named Salvatore Maranzano. Both men were immigrants from Sicily. Both believed in the old traditions of the mafia: absolute loyalty, absolute authority, and absolute violence. What followed became known as the Castellammarese War, a brutal mafia civil war that would terrorize New York between 1930 and 1931. At the center of this storm stood a younger generation of gangsters, men who had grown up in America, men who believed the mafia needed to evolve. One of them was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano had risen through the ranks under Masuria's organization. Born in Sicily but raised in New York's Lower East Side, he had built a powerful network of criminal partners. Among them were men who would later become legends of organized crime: Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Benjamin Siegel. Unlike the older Sicilian bosses, Luciano believed organized crime should operate like a business. He worked with Jewish gangsters, Irish gangsters, anyone who could make money. To the old world bosses like Masuria and Maranzano, this was dangerous and disrespectful. By 1930, the Castellammarese War had exploded into open violence. Gunmen stalked the streets of New York. Bodies appeared in alleyways, restaurants, social clubs. Dozens of mobsters were murdered. The war divided the underworld into two sides: the Masuria faction and the Maranzano faction. Both bosses demanded absolute loyalty, and Luciano was caught in the middle. Publicly, he remained loyal to Masuria, but privately, he was losing faith in the old boss. Masuria was paranoid, old-fashioned, and increasingly reckless. He demanded loyalty from younger gangsters, but offered little trust in return. Luciano began to believe that as long as the old bosses remained in power, the war would never end, and the money would never truly flow. Something had to change. Behind the scenes, Luciano made a dangerous decision. He secretly opened negotiations with Masuria's enemy, Salvatore Maranzano. The two sides reached a silent understanding. If Masuria were eliminated, the war would end. But Luciano had one condition. After Masuria was gone, the mafia would need a new structure, a modern organization. No more absolute bosses, no more endless wars. For Maranzano, it seemed like a small price to pay. He agreed, and with that agreement, Joe Masuria's fate was sealed. February 26, 1931. A small restaurant in Coney Island. Luciano and Masuria sit down for lunch. They play cards, talk business, drink wine. The atmosphere is calm, friendly even, but Luciano already knows what's coming. At one point, he excuses himself from the table. "I'll be right back," he says. He steps outside. Moments later, the assassins enter. Among the gunmen believed to be involved were rising mob enforcers. Albert Anastasia, Benjamin Siegel, and possibly Vito Genovese. The shooters fire rapidly. Bullets tear through the restaurant. Masuria collapses beside the card table, dead before he hits the floor. Luciano returns minutes later, calm, composed. To the police, he claims he had stepped out for fresh air. No witnesses would contradict him. The official report lists the killers as unknown, but everyone in the mafia understood exactly what had happened. The old boss was gone. For Charles Luciano, the plan had worked. The war seemed over. Salvatore Maranzano now stood as the most powerful boss in New York, and Luciano expected to become his most trusted ally. But Maranzano had other plans. Within months, he would declare himself the Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses, the absolute ruler of the American Mafia. It was exactly the old system Luciano had hoped to destroy. And soon, Luciano would realize something terrifying. Maranzano was preparing to eliminate him. What followed next would unleash a wave of murders that would change the American Mafia forever. And the bloodiest feud New York had ever seen was only just beginning. Spring 1931, New York City. The Castellamarese War appears to be over. Joe Masuria is dead. The gunfire that once echoed through the streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn has faded. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the Mafia's brutal civil war seems finished. At the center of this new order stands one man, Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano had achieved what he had fought for since the war began. Power. Absolute power. In the months following Masuria's murder, Maranzano called a meeting of New York's most powerful mob leaders. It was held quietly, away from police attention. Inside the room were representatives of every major faction in the city. Men who had survived the bloodshed of the Castellamarese War. Men who had watched dozens of friends die. Maranzano stood before them and made an announcement that would reshape the Mafia. He declared himself Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. It was an ancient Sicilian title, one that symbolized total authority over all Mafia families. From that moment forward, Maranzano would rule New York's underworld. Every crime family, every racket, every boss, they all answered to him. To some in the room, it sounded like peace. To others, it sounded like a return to tyranny. Maranzano also reorganized the Mafia's structure. New York's criminal organizations were divided into 5 official families. Each would operate under its own boss. Each would control its own territory and rackets. Among the leaders chosen were men who would later become legends of organized crime. Joe Prophesy, Tommy Gagliano, Vincent Mangano, Joseph Bonanno, and the final family was placed under the leadership of a young and ambitious gangster, Charles Luciano. To the outside world, Luciano appeared to have one. He now controlled one of the 5 most powerful crime families in America. But inside the Mafia, trust was rare, and Maranzano was a man shaped by suspicion. He had spent years fighting rivals, watching for betrayal. He believed the only way to keep power was to eliminate potential threats before they could act. And in Maranzano's eyes, one man stood above all others. Charles Luciano. Luciano represented everything the old Sicilian bosses feared. He was Americanized. He worked with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky. He conducted business with Irish racketeers. He believed organized crime should expand beyond ethnic loyalty. To Maranzano, this was dangerous. To him, the Mafia was a sacred Sicilian institution. It belonged only to Sicilians, and Luciano's growing influence was becoming impossible to ignore. Within months of taking power, Maranzano began quietly planning another purge. His targets were clear: Charles Luciano and the younger generation of gangsters surrounding him. The first warning came quietly. A message passed through the underworld, a whisper among mobsters. Someone inside Maranzano's circle had spoken. The boss was preparing a list, a death list. At the top of that list was Charles Luciano. When Luciano heard the rumor, he did not panic. He understood the rules of organized crime. If someone planned to kill you, you acted first. And Luciano had one advantage Maranzano underestimated. He had allies outside the traditional mafia. Among Luciano's closest partners was Meyer Lansky. Unlike the old Sicilian bosses, Lansky was not Italian. He was Jewish, but he was also one of the most brilliant financial minds in organized crime. Lansky had built massive gambling networks. Money flowed through casinos, betting operations, and underground banks. And Lansky believed the future of organized crime depended on cooperation, not tradition. When Luciano told him about Maranzano's plan, Lansky gave him one simple piece of advice: don't wait. By the summer of 1931, tension filled the underworld. The Castellamarese War had technically ended, but everyone knew something was coming. Two visions of the Mafia were now colliding: Maranzano's old Sicilian hierarchy and Luciano's modern criminal empire. One of them would survive. The other would die. September 10th, 1931. Manhattan. Salvatore Maranzano sits inside his office at 230 Park Avenue. The building houses his legitimate front business, a real estate office. From the outside, everything appears normal. But Maranzano has been nervous for weeks. He has increased security, restricted visitors, and ordered several men to begin preparing for Luciano's execution. What he does not know is that Luciano has already made his move. Earlier that morning, 4 men enter the building. They wear suits, carry briefcases. They look like federal agents. According to witnesses, they identify themselves as government investigators. They demand access to Maranzano's office. The guards hesitate, but the authority in their voices seems convincing. The men are allowed upstairs. Moments later, the office door closes. Inside, Salvatore Maranzano looks up from his desk and realizes something is terribly wrong. The men are not government agents. They are assassins. What happens next takes less than a minute. The killers rush forward. Maranzano tries to resist, but he is outnumbered. Knives flash in the air. Gunshots echo through the office. When the attackers leave the room, Salvatore Maranzano lies dead on the floor. The boss of all bosses is gone. Just 6 months after declaring himself the ruler of the Mafia, the hit sends shockwaves through New York's underworld. 2 of the most powerful bosses in America have now been murdered in the same year. Joe Masuria, Salvatore Maranzano, both victims of carefully planned betrayals. And behind both assassinations stands the same man, Charles Luciano. But this time, Luciano doesn't claim power for himself. Instead, he does something no Mafia boss had ever done before. He abolishes the title Capo di Tutti Capi. No single boss would ever control the entire Mafia again. Instead, Luciano creates a new governing body, a council of crime families, a ruling commission that would settle disputes and prevent future wars. It would become known simply as the Commission, and with its creation, a new era of organized crime begins. But the violence of the Castellamarese War had left deep scars, and the consequences of these betrayals would shape the Mafia for decades to come. Autumn 1931, New York City. Within a single year, 2 of the most powerful Mafia bosses in America had been executed: Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both men had once believed they controlled the future of organized crime. Both had demanded absolute loyalty. Both had ruled through fear. And both had died the same way, betrayed. The Castellamarese War was finally over. But the Mafia that emerged afterward was no longer the same organization that had entered the war. The old Sicilian hierarchy had collapsed. The era of the mustache Pete's, old world bosses who demanded strict Sicilian traditions, was fading. And replacing them was a new generation of Americanized gangsters. At the center of that transformation stood one man, Charles Luciano. Luciano had spent years watching how power destroyed Mafia leaders. Joe Masuria had ruled with greed and paranoia. Salvatore Maranzano had demanded absolute authority. Both systems had led to war. Luciano believed the Mafia needed something different. Not another dictator, but a structure. A system that would prevent future bloodshed. Because the real money wasn't in war. The real money was in business. Shortly after Maranzano's murder, Luciano began organizing a secret meeting. Not a meeting of one family, but of every major criminal organization in the United States. The gathering took place quietly in Chicago, under heavy secrecy. Representatives arrived from New York, Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, and other cities where organized crime had taken root. Among those present were some of the most powerful gangsters in America: Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joe Prophesy, Joseph Bonanno, and the powerful Chicago boss, Al Capone. Though Capone himself was facing legal pressure at the time, his influence in the Chicago outfit remained enormous. At the meeting, Luciano proposed a radical idea. There would be no more boss of all bosses. No single man would rule the mafia. Instead, the families would form a governing council. Each family boss would sit on the council. Major decisions would require approval. Disputes would be settled by vote, and no boss could declare war without permission. The organization would be run like a board of directors, a criminal corporation. The council would be called the Commission. The Commission would include leaders from the 5 families of New York, as well as representatives from powerful crime groups across the country. Chicago, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Detroit. The goal was simple: prevent another Castellamarese war, because the last one had nearly destroyed the mafia itself. Too many soldiers dead, too much police attention, too much chaos. The commission would bring stability, and stability meant profit. At first, the system worked. The mafia entered one of the most powerful periods in its history. Bootlegging profits were replaced by new rackets, illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, labor union control, construction rackets, waterfront extortion. The American mafia became a nationwide criminal enterprise. And at the center of it all was Luciano's network. Luciano himself now controlled the crime family once dominated by Joe Masuria. Over time, it would become known as the Luciano crime family. Decades later, it would evolve into what the world now knows as the Genovese crime family. But despite his influence, Luciano rarely presented himself as the supreme leader. He preferred to operate quietly, behind the scenes, letting the commission maintain balance between the families. For several years, the system held. But outside the mafia, law enforcement was beginning to adapt. The rise of organized crime during Prohibition had attracted national attention. Federal authorities were slowly building stronger investigative units. Prosecutors began targeting mob bosses not for individual murders, but for large criminal conspiracies, racketeering, tax evasion, organized gambling. The government had learned a crucial lesson. To weaken the mafia, they needed to dismantle its leadership. In 1936, that strategy finally struck Charles Luciano himself. The investigation was led by a relentless prosecutor, Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey had been studying New York's criminal networks for years, and he believed Luciano was at the center of a massive prostitution and vice operation. Using witness testimony, undercover investigations, and financial records, Dewey built a case. It was one of the largest organized crime prosecutions ever attempted. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, police, curious spectators, all watching as the most powerful gangster in America faced justice. Luciano denied the charges, but the testimony against him was overwhelming. Women connected to the prostitution ring described the structure of the operation, how payments moved through intermediaries, how profits were collected and distributed. The prosecution argued that Luciano controlled the entire system, even if he rarely appeared in public. In June 1936, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. Charles Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. For many Americans, it seemed like the end of the mafia's most powerful leader. But inside organized crime, Luciano's influence didn't disappear. Even behind bars, his system continued to function. The commission remained in place. Crime families continued operating. The machine he had created was larger than any single boss. Years later, during World War II, Luciano would even assist the U.S. government. Naval intelligence contacted him while he was still in prison. They believed the mafia could help protect American docks from sabotage. Luciano's influence over waterfront unions proved valuable. In 1946, his prison sentence was commuted, but he was immediately deported. Back to Italy, Charles Luciano would spend the rest of his life outside the United States, living between Italy and Cuba, still maintaining quiet connections to the American underworld. In January 1962, Luciano died of a heart attack at Naples International Airport. He was 64 years old. The man who had reshaped the American mafia was gone, but the structure he built, the commission, the 5 families, the national criminal network, all of it continued long after his death. The murder of Joe Masuria in 1931 had been more than just another mob hit. It had triggered the final collapse of the old mafia order, the bloodiest feud New York had ever seen, a war that killed dozens of mobsters, and ultimately led to the creation of a criminal empire that would dominate organized crime for the next half-century. In the world of organized crime, loyalty was always temporary. Power was always borrowed, and the rules were simple. Trust no one, because the same men who call you boss today may already be planning your funeral tomorrow.